making a patchwork of ethical theories, different ethical theories, like kind of picking to some extent, and this is one of the things hopefully people will learn in this class, you can sort of generate a patchwork of different ethical theories. And it's not just, arbitrarily choosing, well, I like, what this ethical theory says, and then, I like what this one says, so I'm gonna put it, you have to, there's learning how to examine and ensuring that, these pieces you're putting together are really consistent. But in general, there's no, at the end of this module period, when we're going to be learning about 4 different ethical theories, there's no requirement to just adopt a single one of them. I think that Western analytic philosophy really encourages people to sort of pigeonhole themselves and be like, well, I'm this, I have this kind of view, I do this sort of thing. And I think that that's a problem. So one thing I want everybody to bear in mind as we're, like moving through these different kinds of ethical theories during this module period is that you are not, just because you like certain aspects of a single theory doesn't mean that like, all right, it's all or nothing. You have to take that theory or you don't, or like you have to throw it away. There's definitely a lot of wiggle room there. Okay. So ethical theories, or what we might describe as normative ethical theories. What do they do? All right. So the book, I pulled this from the textbook. The thinking behind, sort of discerning these individual theories is that certain moral values can be linked together, sometimes loosely and sometimes lightly, but they all center around certain key ideas or central values. So if you remember in past lectures, I kind of talked about, stringing together, different values, right? And there might be some core values at the center. It's really important that, no matter what moral obligations our theory ascribes, that those obligations honor or some way bearing in mind certain core ethical values. So in that way, those values, kind of like creating like a web, maybe you can think of it that way. They're not just obviously a random collection of things that we care about. There are but at the same time, there are going to be some unifying threads that can sort of draw together different values that maybe initially we felt like weren't totally connected, but then on closer examination, we realize that they are. So this is a pretty abstract concept, right? Like I'm sort of giving an outline in describing this without giving you any like meat or content, like what particular moral values we might sort of draw together with some unifying thread. So we have 4 examples here of essentially what we can think of as 4 different kinds of webs that are going to end up drawing together or pulling together a number of different moral values. And what I have on the slide up here is essentially what lies at the core of each of those webs. Okay. So as we're moving through in this module period and discussing these individual ethical theories, what's going to happen is I'm going to start in speaking about these core values. And then from there, we're going to draw some unifying threads to other values. And something that we're going to find is maybe we don't end up drawing a thread, say, to a value that we think is really important. Like we might agree with the core value set, but we realize that it's not bringing in everything that feels important that we want to bring in, right? So that's sort of, that's where we can end up doing some of this patchwork moving around stuff. Okay, So yeah, and again, I want to reiterate, I understand maybe what I said might feel a little bit like, wait, what is she talking about? But as we're moving through the module period and doing this over and over again and looking like, okay, what's at the core of the, what's the core of the web here? Like what's getting brought in, what's getting left out? It'll start to become a little bit clearer and more familiar. I'll be reiterating the things that I just said many times. So don't worry if you don't feel like you totally understand it now. Okay, so what are the basic core values involved with each of the ethical theories that we're going to be looking at during this module period? So today, we're going to be looking at the ethics of persons. So at the core of that normative ethical theory, we have values associated with dignity and acknowledgement of personhood, of our humanity. There's something. So by virtue of, really attending to those two things that we value, human dignity and acknowledging someone's personhood, we're going to end up being able to draw in a lot of other moral values. So that's what we're going to be looking at today. Next week, we're going to be looking at what we could roughly describe as the ethics of happiness. So their ethics is centering around, it's not just, sort of like superficial happiness, like maybe the happiness that we get when we like get a new pair of shoes that we really love or something like that. It's a very rich notion of happiness. We'll spread that and we'll dive into that a little bit more next week. But the basic idea being like the good positive feelings. Like what can we do that is going to really promote that? Essentially, what kind of actions can we take that are going to make the most people the most happy? Okay. And then the following week, what we're going to be looking at is the ethics of virtue. And there, what we start with is the idea that individual human flourishing is of the highest importance. That's the thing at the core, at the center of our moral value web. And then from there, we'll sort of examine like, all right, so what does human flourishing, when somebody was really living up to their potential as a human, what does that look like? And one thing that we're going to very quickly find, or that often gets argued, is that, that takes a kind of, you have to really, there's ways in which you nourish. There are very specific ways in which you can nourish the part of you that can sort of like help you, all these little parts, these aspects of yourself, little character traits, things like this. As soon as you're like really working on them and trying to like do those kinds of things, think about things in a really good way. From there, it's just sort of like all the good behavior just shows up. But it's really like the idea being like through like practicing and trying to like attain these admirable character traits. So then the last normative ethical theory we're going to be looking at is called the ethics of relationship. So what happens there is we put at the core of our web, our normative ethical theory web, lies in sort of the information that our feelings and our feelings about the people that we care about, that we're perhaps close to, but not necessarily, people that we feel like some kind of connection with in various ways. And from those feelings, from those relationships, just sort of like the values that arise from that, we can build an entire ethical theory. So you can sort of think of it, like you can think of a place where you're with a group of people who, those are like your people that you would say, like it's like ride or die, or the people that, you would do anything for, like the people that you love the most, maybe the people you would choose to live on a desert island with. Like you start with those relationships there, and just sort of reflect on what kind of moral values are involved in those relationships. And then from there, you build out your ethical theory web. Okay. So, yeah. So that's just the general overview of how we're going to be examining these individual theories and sort of like what a rough idea of what these individual theories look like. So do I have any questions right off the bat? Would anybody like me to clarify anything before I move on? Okay, well, without further ado, we are going to move to our next normative ethical theory, or our first one, the ethics of persons. All right. So, the ethics of persons really starts with this basic idea that there is something special about us. And as a result, there are going to be moral obligations that arise from this special nature, this special thing about humans. And in particular, that specialness about us has a kind of dignity. There's some like human dignity that demands respect, one might say. And the textbook sort of spells this idea out, in particular, this idea of like what dignity looks like and what respecting someone looks like in the following way. No one is to be reduced to a mere means to others' ends. Social relations require fairness, justice, and equality. Human and civil rights are essential too, as they secure the space in which each person is recognized and can flourish. Okay. So we have sort of three components here. The first one being this idea that you can't treat people as a means to an end. So this was something actually I think that Ray brought up when he was talking about his answer to the quiz question, right? Ray, did you want to elaborate on that just a little bit?
Okay. It's like basically people are using these social apps as it benefits not everybody, but it only benefits people with particular characteristics that are met within what the dating app requires. And sometimes when people don't have success with those apps in like a day or a week, they end up deleting the app. So it works for some people and it doesn't work for others.
Yeah. In particular, I remember you mentioned, just like there's like certain people might have like
all filters, like whether they're tall, short, like height, weight, physical appearance. Like I also mentioned in the quiz something like the dislike and like buttons in the Tinders and Grinders apps, like just based off what the person looks like in the profile and what they add as a little summary. You can just tap and dislike or like, and it's like that diminishes a person's self-esteem. Like you can tell when someone skips you, you can tell when someone likes you, and that sort of thing is like, yo, like y'all bringing down my confidence.
Yeah. Okay. I think these are such perfect things to keep in mind, and specifically what the ethics of persons advocates for. So this idea of, reaching out to somebody, asking them out on a date, whatever, like strictly based on physical appearance. Physical appearance doesn't capture what our dignity, right? Like there's like this, like the thing that I was just talking about, this like special thing about humans, that sort of thing. Sort of right out the gate, one of the things that goes by the wayside in terms of, you know, like moral obligations is having a moral obligation to treat somebody some kind of way simply because of how they look. And when we find behaviors that treat people better, right, simply because of how they look, or treat other people worse simply because of how they look, there's some kind of like, there's just like, there's some, you're objectifying somebody. There's a reason why we use that kind of language, right? Like you're not treating them as a human, you're treating them as something based on the way that they look. And that's sort of a quintessential example of what we would call treating somebody as a means to an ends. There's some kind of gratification. Like maybe you just really like the way they look. Maybe it's, you know, I think that a lot of the time people treat people a certain kind of way in order to get them to respond in a certain kind of way. Let's see. Yeah, there's like some other people that were, yeah. Yeah, so I think like Tianika said in the chat box, like that she said that she thinks that the ethics of persons wouldn't condone the dating apps because you're not respecting them or valuing them. You just do what you want because of a temporary feeling, which has nothing to do with like them as a person, right? And then yeah, and then Shanili, you make a really good point here, I think, about like sexual relationships in particular. Did you want to elaborate at all on that, like using somebody in that sense? I mean, I think you did it. It's pretty straightforward what you said, but
So sorry, I'm still going through it.
oh no, if you don't want to speak, it's totally fine too. I
No,
understand.
I'm okay. I just had to clear my throat really quickly.
Okay.
Sorry, guys. I've been sick. So basically, I'm not really sure. I've never been on these apps, so all I know is kind of like what movies say about it, like you
Yeah,
know, the sexual aspect about it.
Mhm.
So when I see these apps, I see them as a means to achieve end goal, which is pleasure. And in doing so, that reduces people to these empty vessels meant to be used like temporary tools to be done away with once that end goal is met, which is that sexual relationship. Then it's like, peace, I'm out, you know?
Ooh, that
And
is, yeah, that's like that I think like in particular, if yeah, anybody who was like, what does this means to an end thing? I think that like what Shanili just said about using somebody as a vessel, like just treating them as a vessel and then throwing them away when they're done, like that's that's like a perfect way to describe exactly what's going on there with that concept. Yeah, Shanili.
And also very, very briefly, like when we talk about ethics in the like prior classes, we talk about this concept of taking care of others. And to take care of others, that's also requires this transparency of being honest. And on these apps, being honest about your sexual history or being honest about your health. And I'm not sure if that's always the case. That's also like a violation, I guess, in some sense.
Yeah. So we're gonna definitely be talking about deception shortly. That's definitely like a huge issue. And the reason why I specifically chose the apps Tinder and Grindr is because those are the ones that really they really have pushed hard for a long time to focus mostly on appearance versus other dating apps that do more in the way of like giving people space to really like try to talk about who they are. But I mean, really, there's ways that you can use all of these apps well, I think. And there's definitely ways that you can use all of these apps to objectify people. Victoria, yeah.
Yes, I was just going to say that some people have benefited from this. I've heard about the app, but I didn't even know about all these things we're talking about. All I know is that they put in their information, heights and stuff. But I know some go in the with their own volition. No one forces them to do so, and some have had successes. Some have gone ahead to marry whoever they found on those apps. So I'm trying to I'm thinking about the fact that whoever logs in there is also using somebody. It's like everyone is using the other. So where do you draw the line here?
So yeah, so we're gonna dig into this like a lot more, but that's why I just said made the point that I made, where like all of these, I think that anytime you can just put your picture out on the internet, sort of like reaching out, trying to date people, there are ways that, you know, those people that you would like talk with, connect with, might exploit you, might disrespect you, might undermine, you know, this special quality, like treat you as an object and ignore your special quality that you have as a human. And then there are most certainly like instances, I'm not saying this is something that always happens on Tinder, or always happens on Grindr, but there's been a lot of criticism around those apps for that kind of behavior. It's just sort of like a norm that has like cropped up. But there's definitely times where it works out too. I mean, it's like you said, you know, there is a kind of using people, and it's not that, and we're going to talk about this more when we talk about Kant, but a really important point when we're talking about not using other people as a means to an end is we always end up using people as a means to some extent, but there's ways that we can sort of do that and still honor their humanity. And like in the examples that Shaylee was talking about and that Ray was talking about, those are instances where people are simply strictly solely treated as a means to an end, and so their humanity has been undermined. Ray, you wanted to add something?
Yes, I was gonna say that these apps aren't generally considered hookup apps, so it's like those individuals that sign themselves up, they should already know what to expect, so they shouldn't be disappointed. You know, you sign yourself up, you should know that it's like this is what this app is intended for, because I've never seen an advertisement for Grindr or Tinder, but I've seen advertisements for other apps that have actually had success with people, meaning that is intended for people to meet, you know.
So something that is really interesting that comes up here, you bring up this word expectations. Yeah, and I think this is something that Victoria was getting at too, right? Like this idea, like people are like signing up for this by their own volition, like nobody's forcing them to do it. That's fine. But as we're going to see very shortly with Kant, and like this basic idea of the ethics of persons says that it doesn't matter whether or not you kind of like sign away your freedom, like you should always be respecting that in another person. So I think that this is also a really interesting place for us to think about, like maybe there might be circumstances where like people consent to kind of like just treating each other as like strictly solely only as means to a certain end, and we actually feel like that's okay. So yeah, I think that that's like another good objection to keep in mind with this stuff, where like maybe in some contexts we say that, you know, respecting a person's humanity is really, really important, but there might be some contexts in which we say that it's okay to not do that. So there's flexibility there. I think that it's a good objection to keep in mind though. Caden, did you have something that you wanted to add? I noticed your hand was up a little bit ago.
No, actually you answered it, which is, you know, the whole point of when people go on those apps, they're both like want the same thing. So that's where I was kind of confused when I was answering the question. It's kind of like, yeah, you know, do it because you both know what you want. But then when I read the entire chapter, I realized, oopsie, no, I'm so wrong.
Well,
so yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, I think this is a good thing that this theory should make us uncomfortable in this way, because it helps us see something that's really important about like, when do we want to take, when I was mentioning, like, here's these core values, right? Like at the center of our webs, right? When do we here, I think if we want to say that dignity and acknowledgement of each person, has to be at the core center of the web. And like, that is the thing that all of this logic for the argument that we're going to talk about is built from, nothing else, at the exclusion of everything else. Then we find these little weird pockets of like, but what about people who are just like wanting to hook up on these dating apps? Like, it really doesn't feel like anything's going on there that's wrong. Like, why do we want to apply that obligation in every single context? So yeah, this is good. This is some really good skepticism to have going in, because I do think that there are aspects of this theory that really resonate with us as well, right? Like we talked about a couple weeks ago in your group discussions, I'm sure you remember, like this idea of respect. This is a really specific idea of respecting someone, and we'll spell out a little bit more what that means, that kind of respect means, in just a moment. But this term, respect or disrespect, or, like treating me like I have dignity, like recognizing my dignity, right? Like those sorts of things, I would imagine every single person who is listening who is in this virtual classroom right now has had an instance where they have felt like they felt hurt because somebody didn't recognize that, somebody didn't honor that, right? And this ethical theory lends a lot of weight, legitimizes that hurt. It not only legitimizes it, but it gives a really clear answer as to why what that person did to you under those circumstances was wrong, right? And that's a really useful, powerful tool to have. So I like all the skepticism going in, because I think there's aspects of this argument that really suck people in right away. They're like, yeah, like absolutely, without question, like the ethical theory that's all about respect, right? And when we spell it out, we see like, like maybe we don't want this to apply across the board. So I do want us to like get into the nitty-gritty details of this theory. But before I do, I don't remember exactly who had their hand up, but I think I saw some hands up. Is there anybody who wanted to like expand on a point that was made or anything like this? Or did anyone have any questions? All right, Shanila, yeah, if you're cool holding on to it, I have a feeling that it'll be relevant. Whatever you're going to say is going to be relevant shortly. Okay, so we have this general idea of ethics of persons, ones that involve not using people, not objectifying people. And additionally, something that we haven't talked about too much yet is that there's obligations that arise from our social relations as a result of respecting our humanity. So specifically, like what our government does for us, right? Our social relationships with like our governing bodies and that sort of thing, where we are entitled to fair treatment, justice, and equality. So essentially, like if you go in, say you have like a blank slate for starting a society, which is like might be a weird kind of thing to think about. But like, if you could just sort of start a society from scratch, and you walked in though with like, all right, I am a person that is like all about the ethics of persons. Like that's my ethical theory that I'm going to use to inform my decisions about how I'm going to construct this society. The things that sort of naturally are going to come out are going to be just as a result of that, of your mindset, of your belief system, right? Are going to be, you're going to want to have policies that, protect, ensure that people are treated fairly, that people are treated justly, that there's like a form of like justice, and that everybody is treated equally. And in that as well, we have civil rights, ones that specifically sort of ensure or protect freedoms to act in certain kind of ways, and protect people against other people stopping them from taking action. So we're going to talk about this a little bit more at the end of at the end-ish of the lecture, but specifically like this idea of, like we have some positive rights, which are rights that involve things that we get, like things that are given to us. So you could think of healthcare as a positive right. Shelter, food, education, public roads, a lot of, so things like that. So things that are like given to us. And then we have rights that are often characterized as negative rights, like rights that, like you can't go around like punching people in the face, right? Like you get like an assault charge if you do something like that, right? Like laws that like stop other people from doing things to you, or potentially stop the government from doing things to you. Like that's very much like the Bill of Rights in the Constitution in the United States is almost exclusively focused on protecting people's negative liberties, negative rights, like negative freedoms, where, like the government can't, control your speech, that sort of thing. So yeah, we'll dig into those things in a bit, but that's just to give you a sort of full picture of like, we have things coming out of this ethics of persons theory, ranging from, Tinder is bad to protect free speech, right? We have a lot. So that's like the range of things that we're seeing, values that we're going to end up finding in the web that we can generate from these core sets of values involved with dignity and acknowledgement of people's personhood. Okay, so one of the first things to think about, I've mentioned a couple of times, but one of the first things we want to think about is like familiar places where we find this kind of thinking, because it might not have been formulated or presented to you as a like, here's a normative ethical theory, but we see different iterations of this pretty often. So one place that this is found is with a couple of philosophers that were discussed in the textbook, but I think that it's a thing that we often see. I feel like it's like there's like a certain kind of like influencer maybe on Instagram that like expresses this kind of tone, but it's like also something that I think that we like experience in daily life, where we just like are kind of like struck by a connection with another person. It's like there's just something that hits you about like, wow, this person in front of me, like I wasn't expecting to find it, but like I feel humanity between us, right? So I think one of the examples that got talked about in the textbook was an instance where like this person who like grew up kind of like out of any big city, like shows up, I think it was like Penn Station, maybe the first time. And she meets a woman who doesn't have stable housing. She's like panhandling at Penn Station. And like this traveler, this woman, was kind of like a little bit scared at first, and then like engaged in conversation and like walked away from the conversation being like, oh my gosh, like she kind of walked in being like, oh, that's like a other like thing that, she wasn't recognizing like this person who is panhandling like as another human, and then through conversation like felt this connection, kind of like hit her by the like what's the word, kind of like took her by surprise. So yeah, so that's like this, like these like feelings that we get in connection with others, kind of moving from this like othering of a person to seeing, we are both human here, feeling that connection. Another very common place we find this thing is in a lot of different religions, where, honoring humanity, respecting humanity is something that is acquired through revelation. It's something that God reveals. And there's a bunch of different ways that, that argument kind of gets spelled out in different religions, but that's the basic idea, is like we feel or we're essentially like it's revealed to us that there's this humanity, there's this specialness of persons, and that's something that ought to be respected. So Kant does something a little bit different than the two things I just described. He uses a very detailed and precise argument, right? So I don't know if you remember way back when I was talking about arguments and I was talking about like reasons and evidence that supports a conclusion, right? And you can just you can write it in the chat box if you like, or whatever, but would anybody like me to go over that idea again? That idea of what an argument is? Okay. Oh, yes. Okay. Well, arguments, roughly understood, are constructed of a series of what are called premises that provide support for a conclusion. And premises function as reasons that once you tie them together, they give support. They prove that the conclusion is true. Let's see. One argument that we can, so an example of a really simple argument would be something like a really common one, would be let's pretend that everybody has to take the train to Lehman or whatever. And let's see, oh my gosh, I can't believe that I'm forgetting the trains that go to Lehman. What is it? Can somebody, it's the D, wait, which one?
Full train?
Oh, the 4, yeah, the 4 and the 6, right? It's the 6 and the, right? Am I completely?
I thought the 4. You
There's
get
a
off.
4? I've done it so many times. I can't believe I'm blanking on it. It's one of those kinds of mornings.
Actually, it depends on where you're coming from too. So.
Okay. Yeah. Of course, I'm doing it from my biased perspective. Okay, but let's say that you rely on the 4 to get to Lehman. I think that's actually that train's seems to run on time, weather permitting, pretty regularly. So you say to yourself, okay, so I have class at 9 a.m. and let's pretend that you're really lucky and it only takes you 40 minutes to get to school. All right, so it takes me 40 minutes to get to school. I never have to wait any longer than 10 minutes for the train. So as long as I leave my house at 8:10, let's say, I'll be to school on time. Because in the past, I've left my house at 8:10, and the train's only been delayed 2 times. So I can reasonably assume that if I leave my house at 8:10 today, I will get to class at 9 a.m. on time. typical argument. So there you have premises, you're appealing to like your past experiences, and you're saying like, well, the past experiences, like I've done this like 100 times and only 2 of those times it's been late. Therefore, just based off of probability, the probability like that, or rather, this gives me good reason to think that it's more than likely that leaving at 8:10 will get me to school on time. Therefore, I'm gonna say that that if I leave at 8:10, then I will likely get to school before 9 a.m. Okay, so that's like a classic. That's like a pretty like normal argument that we make. You have some evidence, you have some, some tools for saying what the evidence can prove. And then you say, what your conclusion is that you draw from that. So that is roughly the kind of reasoning that Kant uses in his argument. But before I move on, would anybody like me to explain this idea of like what an argument looks like a little bit more? Does this feel, is anybody still confused? I can try explaining it another way, or I could give another example.
What is it like taking a stand, like taking a position and then giving like arguing like defending a position, like you talk about something and then you defend that position. Is it in line with what we are discussing?
Yeah. So the way that you're thinking about it is just kind of like the reverse order. So if we, what I was saying is like, I was spelling out the reasons, I was giving the premises and then followed by the conclusion. And if you you can think about it in the flip way too, where you say something and you have your conclusion. You're like, here, oftentimes this is how I think a lot of people are taught to write things in like research papers, right? Where you like have your thesis statement and then you go through and you give your evidence. It's the same thing. It's just how it's just a difference in order in how it's being presented. Does that clear it up?
Yeah. And then I think sometimes too, you have to, if your whatever evidence you have evidence to support whether indeed your claim is supported by those are like it's a fact that whatever you said, your conclusion is defending that.
Yeah. And there's a bunch of different things to do there. I mean, like we're speaking about arguments very generally. I was talking about, making an argument about taking the train and getting to school on time. And you can use arguments to do something like that. You can use arguments to do something like, give like a very sophisticated, like, defending some kind of thesis and like a research paper or something like this, as well. Like there's a bunch of different ways that we can give arguments, but the very most basic idea is that, you have some kind of central claim, some kind of thesis statement or a conclusion. Both words work here, kind of talking about the same thing. And then we're giving evidence and reasons to believe that what you say in your thesis statement or your conclusion is true. Okay, that's great. Thanks, Victoria. That helped. I think that made things a little bit clearer. Okay, so Kant takes this approach. He ends up at the same place as the other approaches end up, namely defending this idea that the unique and unassailable moral value of persons is something that needs to be respected. There are moral obligations that stem from that. And he uses an argument to say specifically, not only are these unique and unassailable values of persons something that we are morally obligated to uphold, but that is the place where our moral obligations come from. Okay. So I just want to like, actually, before I move on, I just want to reiterate. So like thinking about it as if it's a web where there's this specialness of persons that reflects certain moral values, and that is at the center of our web, our normative ethical theory web. And it's from that place, and for Kant, from that place only, that we draw our moral obligations. So it's very exclusionary in a number of ways, some of which are good, some of which not so much. But the basic idea being that this specialness about us, this thing that we might feel sometimes when we're in connection with other people or something that like God reveals to us or whatever, like that thing is something that all of our moral obligations come from. Okay. So one of the hard things about teaching Kant is that it's very much a catch-22 in explaining how his ideas all fit together. So when I was in my undergrad, I studied Kant a lot. I took a lot of courses on Kant. I read a massive amount of his work. He's a very prolific writer. And for anybody who read the excerpt from the chapter, I'm sure that you know he's not a very easy person to read. And on top of all of it, there's this thing that happens where it's like you have to understand like his full theory in order to understand the particulars of it. So you're just constantly kind of like mucking through and being like, okay, well, I kind of get this one idea. And then you move to the end and then you come back over and you're like, okay, like now that I understand all these other ideas, like I'm going to try to understand the first set of ideas, maybe, and you get a little bit of clarity and you go all the way to the end with everything and you just keep circling around. It's a little dizzying. So, although I started from saying like, okay, so he's like talking about this, like, you know, these moral values and everything, are these moral values associated with like persons, and all of our moral obligations stem from that. We're going to just table it for one moment, and we're going to talk about another aspect of his theory. Wait a second. Or rather, we're going to talk about a little bit. There we go. I accidentally knocked those out of order. Okay. So I think actually, yeah. All right. I'm gonna give a little bit of background on his view. Kant was during an era in Western analytic philosophy where philosophers they gave entire theories of everything. So like, if you were a philosopher, you were to give a theory of ethics, a theory of metaphysics, an ontological theory. So like so you would have like a theory of everything that exists, a theory of what morality is, a theory of, like the structure of our reality, a theory of knowledge, like all this stuff. Nowadays, like in philosophy, it's much more, it's a lot more focused. But in Kant's day, he was like given a theory of everything. And one of the places that he started was giving a theory of how the human mind is structured. Okay. So a person who had a huge influence on Kant was this other philosopher named Descartes. And Descartes is the one that famously wrote this, "I think, therefore I am." So just quickly in the text box, I'm never sure like how many people have heard this. Yes or no in the chat box. Have you heard this phrase before? "I think, therefore I am." Everybody. And it's totally fine to say no. I just want to get a gauge. I still have quite a few more people that need to. Okay. I think that's almost everybody. All right. So great. The basic idea, I mean, so that's something that I feel like it gets mentioned a lot, like as a, like an aside in like a TV show or something like that. And the basic idea there is if what was going on with Descartes, to really just summarize it very, very quickly. And if you ever take another philosophy class, I promise you, it's far more complicated. And in some ways, what I am about to say is not really accurate, but for the sake of time, what Descartes did was he sat down and he was like, okay, I'm going to doubt every single thing. Like, I am going to like, okay, I can't like trust any of my senses. I can't trust any of the things that I believe. Like, I can't trust that like I can't trust my smell, I can't trust my taste, I can't trust all this stuff. I'm gonna doubt all of it. Like, I'm just gonna say, like, I'm gonna grant anybody who's saying like being skeptical of anything that we can know, I'm gonna say fine. Like, any of the stuff that we think that we know, I'm gonna say like we can't know it. I'll say it's at least, you know, kind of like imagining like a matrix type situation, right? Where it's like, okay, like all the stuff that is all the input I'm getting, all these experiences I'm having, like, let's say that that's entirely fake. Like, and then kind of is like, all right, so what's left? If I'm doubting all this stuff, I'm doubting all of these things that feel like very much everything that I know, what's left? And he finds what's left is that he is still thinking. So from there, Descartes argues that he knows that he exists by virtue of his ability to think, or he knows that that like there's some entity of him that he knows exists by virtue of the fact that it's engaging in this thinking process. Okay. And that project was very influential for a lot of philosophers that followed him. In particular, Kant, and then this other philosopher, David Hume. And the thing, it wasn't that, oh, wow, it's not like a scientific sort of a scientific discovery that Descartes achieved by any means, because it's philosophy. It's more just like, oh, this way that you were thinking about it, that's really interesting. Like, both the two major philosophers that were strongly influenced by Descartes' work were also very strongly objectors to his conclusion that he drew about, like, well, I know that I exist because I'm thinking, therefore I am. So Kant wasn't in agreement with that, but what did influence his way of doing philosophy, or influence like his work that he did, is the approach where we investigate cognitive capacities of a subject, of somebody who claims to know things. So saying like, all right, what necessarily, if this thinking process is happening, what necessarily needs to be the case? Like, what can we learn just by looking at our cognitive capacities? Like, if you imagine, you know, like those kind of like cartoon pictures of like the wheels of somebody's head turning, like when we zoom in and we just look at those wheels, what can we learn? What kind of conclusions can we draw? So what Kant found, I mean, just to like kind of sum up the Descartes stuff, what Kant found about Descartes was that the I am, he didn't buy the I am part. The I am part. He was like, no, there's no, like, the existence claim, like, that's way down the road. We haven't gotten there yet. But this thinking is happening is really important, right? And the thinking that is happening that's really important to Kant, and the way that Kant understands it, is what we might call a capacity to, or what Kant calls a capacity to reason. So those wheels turning that I mentioned before, what that ultimately is for Kant, or the wheels that are in the head that are turning that matter most to Kant, he thinks are like symbolic of humans, are the wheels that provide us with this capacity to reason. And we'll talk a little bit more about what this capacity to reason looks like in a moment. But the important thing to understand now is that we all, in Kant's mind, we all have this capacity to reason. So if we end up exercising it the right way, right? So if we like have all of the gears kind of like linked in, we end up with like this sort of uniform way to investigate and try to understand the world, in particular, form the kinds of arguments that I was talking about just a minute ago. And if we do that well, then the conclusion we draw is going to be the same conclusion that other people who exercise that other capacity in the right way also draw. That's a really, really important thing. It's sort of like you can be sitting on opposite ends of the world in Kant's mind, but you can end up coming to the same conclusion as other people simply by exercising this shared capacity that we all have to reason. And it's that capacity for Kant, like I said a minute ago, that makes us human. It's the thing that for him distinguishes us from other life forms, from other animals, for example. Okay. Does anyone, so that's just to give you some background on this thing that he formulates called the categorical imperative. Does anybody have any questions about that so far? All right. So a categorical imperative. All right. So let's like think about this word a little bit. Does somebody want to tell me what they think the word imperative means? I feel like this is something that, like, a word I probably see most like on TV, like it's imperative that you yeah.
It's important.
Yeah, like,
Here.
Yeah, it's important, it's necessary, you must do it, right? Like, it's a very strong word for obligation. This is an obligation you must act on. It's of the utmost importance kind of thing. So that's what that word means. All right, great. So we got that word down. And now this word categorical. All right. So the best way to understand what this word categorical means is by contrasting it to the word hypothetical. So we're all familiar with like this term, like, oh, it's like a hypothetical situation. Let's just say hypothetically, like it's kind of like, all right, let's do a thought experiment. Let's just like imagine for a minute that this is going on, right? It's like under very specific situations, or rather like in a very specific situation. So when we contrast what the term a hypothetical imperative would be to a categorical imperative, what we can imagine is like saying, all right, so an imperative, or rather a hypothetical imperative, is going to be one that we would have in a hypothetical situation, some particular very specific details situation, just like in theory, like for a minute, this one point in time. Like these are the kinds of obligations that you would have under those circumstances, and under just those circumstances. A categorical imperative is, like the slide says, an obligation that is, or rather an obligation that is going to apply in all situations, without question, across the board. So I think, I don't know about you all, but I feel like I've heard this phrase like categorically false. That's categorically false. Or I categorically deny all your accusations, right? Like those kinds of terms. So in those cases, what somebody is saying is like, what you're saying is false under every circumstance, or I deny every single one of these accusations associated with like some, like some specific like thing that I did. So yeah, so it's like, you can think of like hypothetical as being like a very narrow thing, and then categorical as being all of it. Whatever we're talking about, I am talking about all of it now. And so for Kant, when we're talking about imperatives, we're talking about the obligation for all of it, always, under every circumstance, in every situation. This is when we say something is a categorical, and when there's a categorical imperative to like do X, that means that you do X always, all the time, no matter what, no exceptions, and so on. Okay. So another fun thing about Kant is he loved to say the same thing in a bunch of different ways. In fact, one of the books that he wrote, I think I have it. I believe, yeah, I think this one. Is this one? I thought I have the other one. Yeah, so like you can see here, I know it's backwards, but in his writing, there would be these lines, and it says A, and it has a line number, and then B. And the reason why there's this annotation, like in this book he wrote, The Critique of Pure Reason, is because he wrote the whole book, and then he decided that he missed a lot of important parts, and then he went back and he added a section, essentially he rewrote the book. He went like kind of paragraph by paragraph and rewrote each paragraph. So you can see like, here's what he would say. This is what he said in the first one. And then this is how he like changed the idea here. But I mean, like he's saying the same thing in both cases. He just felt like he needed to say it in a slightly different way. It's not even an addendum. So Victoria asked if it's like an addendum. It wasn't. It was that he was making the same point in a different way. So, one way I was like trying to think of like, what would be a good example to help students understand like what I'm talking about here. And the best one I could come up with is like, we have a lot of different ways to say, I love you to a person, right? Like we could say, I trust you more than anything in the world. And that's like maybe like one way to like, depending on, who you are in your relationship with the person, like when you say that, then like the person knows like, oh, wow, that's what Leah says. Like when she like really loves a person, your priority, like your needs are like my top priority. You are the center of my world, right? Like there's important differences between all of the things that I just said, right? Like there's this element of trust involved with love. Like there is this element of, committing to attending to the other person's needs in this concept of love. And then there's also this like slightly vaguer thing involved with like, okay, you're like this, like the most important person to me, or you're at the center of my world, right? Like somebody might, oh yeah, I love that, Victoria. I think that's actually better. I think that's better than you're the center of my world. So yeah, let's say like we got the trust one, we got your top priority, and then the wind beneath my wings, right? Like you're my support system. Like those are three different faces of, say, maybe what it is for me to express my love for another person. They're all touching on the same thing, but they express different variations on that. So that's what Kant, when we see these different formulations of the categorical imperative, that's what Kant is doing. All right. Does anybody have any questions about that?
I think it makes sense now, like from this, it makes sense now.
Okay. Okay.
Great. He's looking at it from various angles, but yet they are all coming together. To mean the same. That's what I'm thinking, right?
Yes,
in
yes.
different places and angles, but then at the end of the day, it's gonna be one universe. So
It's talking, and this is, I mean, this is very classic for Kant, where like he gives these different perspectives on things, and it's like, it's never, so something, there's aspects of his theories that people often use this phrase like two sides to the same coin. And that isn't at all what Kant is doing when he's talking about stuff. Like he's like, there's these very, we have to like see it from these different angles in order to try to get at what the thing actually is. Okay. So and in some ways, that was connected to the ways in which he thought humans were limited in their capacity to reason. Like we can only really get to the thing to a certain extent. And so it's like by our best estimations, like we have these different angles that we can look at something at. But in reality, on his view, we can't really fully understand the stuff that is at the core. But that doesn't mean that we can't draw important moral obligations from these various examinations of the thing at different angles. So yeah, I think that's really what Victoria said is really good. So if you want to just like think of like that web that I was talking about before. So for Kant, this ball that exists at the center, that from that we draw out all of these different obligations. There are very important different angles that we can look at that ball, and depending on our angle, it helps us understand not only making these connections to other moral obligations, but also seeing how maybe some of those, it's very much 3D, right? Of seeing how these threads might connect together. Like we twisted at one angle, and then all of a sudden we saw, oh, right, this thing that was over on the other side over here, like, but now from looking at it on my perspective and this other obligation that I drew over here, I see why they're connected now. Yeah, Denise. So Denise says like outside looking in, and then all of a sudden you zoom out and you're looking on the outside of it. Yeah, this is why I think this, I'm so glad, Denise, that you mentioned that, because that's a pretty dizzying experience, right? And if everyone remembers, I was saying before, like studying Kant gives you a little bit of motion sickness, because there is so much of this kind of like zooming around these different ideas. So, but I mean, the main point that I wanted to make there is like, that's what's happening with this idea of these different formulations of the categorical imperative. It's examining from a slightly different angle, what our moral obligations look like, or how we can determine what our moral obligations are. The first formulation he gives of this, so like going at it from our first perspective, or the first perspective, is that we should only act according to that maxim, whereby at the same time will it become a universal law. So very strange way to word things. But the basic thinking there is, can I universalize whatever thing I'm saying? So like remember, there's no hypothetical, there's no particular situations. Everything, all your obligations apply all the time, no matter what the situation is, right? Okay, so if you are in an individual situation and you're saying, is it okay for me to do X, right? The first question that you want to ask, according to the first formulation of the categorical imperative, our first glance at it, The question we want to ask is, can I universalize this maxim? Which is to say, if everyone did what I am considering doing in this moment, would my action be successful? Or if everybody did it, so if I willed it that this is how everybody always behaved, would it undermine my ability to successfully take that action? So the classic example that Kant gives involves lying, all right? So the recipe for any maxim. So we look at what the situation is. We look at the action. And then we consider our reason and we universalize, okay? So I imagine that I'm in a sticky situation. And if I lie, I will unstickify myself. I'll get out of it. I won't, maybe it's and it could be, let's say, recent real life example. I was gossiping about my sister to my mom, and my sister overheard my sister was over at my mom's house, and my mom didn't know that she was doing her laundry, and she heard my mom's side of the conversation, right? So she didn't hear what I said, but she heard my mom sort of engaging in this gossip. And so in that moment, for the record, my sister deserves it, but that's a whole other story. So in that moment, my sister approaches me. So then later I talked to my sister. She's like, oh, I heard what mom was saying. And in that moment, right, I could lie and I could be like, yeah, I thought it was really awful, everything that mom was saying, right? Or, I come to terms with it and I tell her, some of my opinions about the ways that she's been behaving lately. So this is I feel like there's a lot of people here right now listening to me tell this story where this is a familiar thing, right? In general, gossip is bad, but also my sister was treating my mom really poorly and she kind of deserved to be talked about in that way. But we're not thinking about that. Right? The particulars of that situation don't matter here. The question for Kant is, okay, so I could lie and I could say, yeah, that was so, avoid the conflict with my sister, maybe even come up with some rationalization in my mind, well, it's just going to hurt her feelings if I tell her, blah, 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 blah. And then what I need to think about though, is if me, in my doing that, my lying to get myself out of the sticky situation, if I think about this idea of this weird way that, what is it? If I will at the same time, my lying become a universal law, right? Do I have to, does that sort of undermine my whole project? Does this make it impossible? Sorry, I feel like that was a little bit scattered. Let me try to explain this one more time again. So when I am considering lying, I'm in a situation where it would behoove me to lie, and I consider lying in that situation, do I need others not to lie in order for my lie to be successful? So essentially, do I need to will that it not become universal law? And if that's the case, Kant says you're not supposed to lie. So when it comes to lying in particular, lying depends on other people telling. The thinking there is lying depends on other people telling the truth. If we always assume that everybody was lying, then we would never assume anybody's telling the truth. It's only the people that deviate from that, right? That lie, that can get away with telling the truth. And if you are doing something essentially where on a global scale, you're trying to make yourself the special exception, right? for Kant, for a number of reasons, that is morally abhorrent. That is not okay. That is prohibited. You are obligated not to let yourself get sucked into that kind of self-centered, I get these expectations. These should be the rules for everybody else, but not for me. Another example that it was funny, actually, it was really just, I think it was last term that I was giving my spiel everybody's familiar with about my attitude towards plagiarism. Yeah, just quickly in the text box, everybody, yes or no, do you remember my spiel about plagiarism? Some of the stuff I was saying in the beginning? A few more people, yeah, right. So it's funny, after like giving that spiel last semester, it struck me, I was like, oh wow, that's a very Kantian argument. Because what I was saying there, right, is like, whatever deception, blah, 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 the purpose of you being here is that I am like helping you think through this stuff. I am giving you some tools. I am helping your education process. And if you are giving me other people's work and I'm engaging with them, I'm not engaging with you, that undermines the purpose of why I'm here, right? If it were the case that everybody always submitted work that they didn't write on their own, it was work that somebody else wrote or an AI wrote or whatever, then we wouldn't have education. We wouldn't have these college classes, right? Someone's ability, rather, I should say, to submit that kind of work and then, fingers crossed, hopefully like I get credit for it, depends on everybody else doing that work, right? If everyone did that, nobody would be here. That's kind of the thinking. It undermines the purpose of really why we're here. If we didn't have that purpose, we wouldn't be here. So it's that kind of, yeah, that's Jose. Yeah, you raised such an interesting point. And I'm trying to work in some conversations about AI, but in schools, because as of right now, a lot of universities are, not Lehman, but other universities, I have friends that teach at other places, they're being told not to even talk to students about it. And clearly it's going to end up being a big problem. What I really like about my argument, my Kantian anti-plagiarism argument, though, is that the idea that you're stealing someone else's work and that's like dishonest to take someone else's work without giving them credit, that holds no water in the face of an AI. You have some kind of, it's just some automata. It doesn't have any feelings, it doesn't have rights to like whatever, right? You're not stealing anybody's work there. It's still wrong though, right? So it's not wrong because it's stealing or whatever. It's wrong because it undermines the purpose of why we're here. But yeah, we can talk about more of that a little bit later. So that's where we get from the first formulation. And what's really important there in connection to this idea that I was talking about before. Remember how I was saying we go around and around in circles with Kant? And I was saying like there's a special capacity to reason. We need to honor that capacity to reason, blah, 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 blah. One of the things that happens when you do something that you make this kind of really morally bad exception for yourself. Like I'm going to lie, but I need everybody else to lie in order for me to get the thing that I want. Something that you do there is you use people as a means to an end, right? Because you are, assuming like everybody is reasoning about things in the right way. Hold on. Yeah. Assuming that, like everybody is like trying to get to roughly the same place on a moral level in terms of moral values, using this capacity to reason, and everybody lands, on the side of like lying's no good. You're using that aspect of their like humanity, the thing that makes them humans, as a means Like kind of like it's kind of like what's wrong with treating people like suckers, right? Like if suckers are really the ones that are like getting at the moral truths, or that are like coming to agreement on like what a moral truth is, everybody's doing that. And you need everybody to sort of convene on that behavior. Say like, you need everybody to like exercise this capacity to reason, to decide that, yeah, lying is actually really not okay. You need them to all be there in order for your lie to be successful. You're using this aspect of the thing that makes them human as a means. You're not respecting it. You're not honoring it, right? Like you're not sort of in the face of that saying like, okay, what's the right thing to do in light of this shared capacity we have to reason? Instead, you're using it as a like, I'm going to get the suckers, I'm going to lie so I can get away with this here. While everybody else goes on with their little truth telling things, I get to do all the things that I want. I get all the nice little things that I want, while everybody else is like trying to aspire to like a moral good, right? Like that's pretty messed up. And it's very much rooted in this idea that that it's this capacity to reason that that needs to be respected. And the second formulation of the categorical imperative really hits at the heart of that idea. So always treating humanity, whether it's in yourself or in another, as an end and never merely as a means. So I want to reiterate here something that came up in the beginning of class. It was something that Victoria mentioned. It was a really good point about the Tinder dating app thing. It's like, well, there was one other person who mentioned it as well.
Ray, I think it was Ray.
Right. Okay, great. Sorry. I always want to give credit. Probably, yeah, I think it's like giving, yeah, that's an important thing to do. So, yeah, this idea of, this is something that people sign up to do, something like they like freely like engage with, right? And while, for Kant, it's, just treating whether or not people agree with it, treating somebody strictly as a means, and totally ignoring their ends in themselves, their humanity, is always off the table. But that doesn't mean that there aren't times where, yeah, we're kind of like using people, but we're keeping their humanity in sight. Like you can ask somebody to help you like pick up your kids from school, right? Like you can ask that of like a friend or like some family member or something like this. Like you can ask for favors like that. And there is a sense in which you're using someone as a means, like they're literally the means for you. You could ask somebody, you could ask your roommate or like family member that you live with to like pick you up some orange juice from the store, right? Like, yeah, you're using them as a means to get the thing to you that you want, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you aren't respecting their humanity, right? Like, I think that's oftentimes why we feel like this obligation to just say, instead of saying like, hey, get me orange juice from the store when you're on your way home. What do we say instead? Somebody give me an example of like a different way, maybe a more polite way that gets phrased.
Oh, please, can you get me maybe a can of juice on your way home or something?
Yeah, or if you don't mind, something like this, right? And when
yeah, if it's not too much to bother, do you think you can stop and get a juice, or like I'll send you the money or something like that? Like, gotta give some incentive that they'll be like, okay, there's something in it for me too. If there's something in it for you,
not necessarily though.
Not even an incentive. It's not. I mean, that's like an additional piece, but that's not.
Okay.
That's not the whole. I mean, that's a part of it, right? Like that's totally right. Wait, I just saw somebody else raise their hand. Who was that?
It was me, Professor.
Yeah, was that Lisa? Wait, who is it speaking now?
Sonia.
Oh, Sonia. Yeah, Sonia.
I was just gonna say, can you do me the favor of getting me orange juice?
Yeah, can you do me the favor, like acknowledging it? And when people don't speak to us in that way, like say somebody says like your whatever who you live with, says to you like, hey, get me orange juice on your way home. How does that, like Sonia, how does that make you feel?
It kind of makes me feel like I don't want to do it.
Yeah, you don't want to do it. It's like, it feels like a little rude, right? I mean, there might be circumstances where you know a person well enough, but like, just, yeah, I mean, if you had a random, you say somebody drops something on the street, it's like a total stranger, and they're like, they look over at you and they're like, hey, get that for me, right? Like, I
Yeah.
think maybe not all of us, but a lot of us are going to feel like that's rude. You don't talk to people like that, right?
Yeah.
One way to explain why that's rude, why they did something that was morally wrong, is using Kant here and saying, hey, like, you don't use me. I'm not just like some empty vessel that you use to like transport the object to you that you want, and then you throw me away when you're done. Like, I am a human, and this is a common phrase we hear people say, I deserve respect. And for Kant, respect means something very specific. It means recognizing a person in terms of their capacity to reason and think about things in the way that you do too. So if we were just walking around treating each other like empty vessels, we wouldn't be in the situation that we are in with one another. We wouldn't have the kinds of, like, we wouldn't have society and like cities and like things like this. Like, that's not the way our world works. You have to exploit the system in order for it to be okay for you to like demand these things. We wouldn't have the kinds of situations or kinds of expectations or social structures that we have if everybody was walking around doing the thing that you're doing, right? So there's like a lot of explanatory power there, just in terms of thinking about, the special capacity we have to reason, what it looks like to respect that capacity, and as a result, this obligation that we have to always treat people as ends in themselves, which again doesn't mean that you can't ask for a favor. It just means that there are obligations, certain moral obligations associated with asking people for a favor. Okay. Does anybody have any questions about the second formulation? Something I just want to bring up, I saw in the chat box, like, so both Denise and Victoria bring up like these words, like, you're like demanding people to do things under this example I just gave. You're ordering them around, right? I think that those are really great ways to conceptualize the stuff that I'm talking about here, because you can't have a world full of authority figures, right? Like, authority figures are only authority figures by virtue of the people they have authority over. So if you just are the one that steals the authority position, right? I mean, there are definitely circumstances where like being the authority on something might make sense. But if you're just like arbitrarily grabbing at it and asserting that, and then just kind of trying to trick someone into slipping into the role of the person that serves you, like, you're really exploiting the system. In general, we assume that, and this is something that is very much connected to what we're going to be talking about in a second, being like rights and persons, or we're going to be talking about in a little bit. But we assume that, these ideas connected with civil liberties, freedom, equality, fairness, justice, built into all of that is everybody isn't the authority figure. Like, we might come up with certain agreements in certain contexts where people are the authority figure, but people don't get to just assert that they're the authority figure. And even something as simple in moments where somebody's like, hey, get that for me, right? Like somebody telling you to do something when there's like no good reason for them to be the authority. And so demanding or ordering you around like that in that moment, they're really exploiting these sorts of like this default supposed system that we exist in, like that is like aspiring towards like equality and justice and these sorts of things. So that's the second formulation. There's a third formulation that is pretty much that's pretty much the same as the first formulation, and so we're not going to talk about it. You don't need to worry about it. And if anybody is like just so interested in Kant and wants to read more, I would be happy to either like suggest specific works of his or like some like interesting links, some like well-written articles that explain these different formulations of the categorical imperative. Yeah, you're welcome to ask me about it in the break, which we're going to go on in just a second, or send me an email if you're interested about the third formulation. So again, skipping the third formulation and on to the fourth. The last perspective that Kant asks us to look at this, like this specialness of humans, the specialness of our ability, our capacity to reason, is cashed out in terms of a kingdom of ends. So on this formulation of the categorical imperative, we are told to act in accordance with the maxims of a person giving universal laws for a merely possible kingdom of ends. So this fourth formulation is sort of a way to bridge the first formulation and the second formulation. So in the first formulation, what we have is this very individual sort of perspective, like coming from like based on where I am situated now, right? Trying to come up with these like universalizable obligations or morally impermissible behaviors, obligations to act a certain way or obligations not to act a certain way. It's another way you can say it. And that's centered very much like just in thinking about it from our perspective. And what the fourth formulation is asking you to do is trying to think more about other people's perspectives, like you existing in a society. It's very much like society and social relation focused, where you're really taking seriously everybody acting in this way. And by virtue of acting in this way, everybody treating one another as ends in themselves, never merely as a means. So just to reiterate, this is kind of a bridging. The fourth formulation bridges the first and the second formulation. So I guess, I can't remember who said it, but it was like, who said the, looking at it like, inside of a house, like being on the inside of a house, or looking at things from the outside, looking at things from the inside of the house and then looking at things from the outside. Like that's kind of like, yeah, I can't remember who made that point. That was a really good way to characterize things here, because what we can think of sort of like the first formulation and the second formulation are like perspectives from inside the house. And then the fourth formulation is kind of zooming out and looking at how those two other formulations are related. So we have this component of, coming up with these universalizable truths, or maxims being like rules, moral rules and obligations for behavior. And then thinking about that as it exists within a society, say, where everybody's doing this thing, where everybody's treating someone as a means to, or as ends in themselves and never merely as a means. So like I was saying, that example that I just gave a minute ago concerning like in society, we have in light, and we're going to talk about this in just a little bit, but in light of like this special thing about humans, this capacity for them to reason and these sorts of rights that they are provided by virtue of that, right? Like rights to like being treated a certain kind of way by others in particular. In a society like that, we are going to value things like freedom and equality and justice. And in that society, there's no room for people to just arbitrarily declare themselves the authority, right? Like that kind of society is one that is going to be very anti like a dictatorship. And what is going to be going on there ultimately is a society that is treating, is respecting like the treating everybody as ends and never merely as means. So I do want to remind everyone that this lecture, I'm recording it and it's going up on Blackboard, because I know this is going to be a lot. We're going to take just a little over a 5-minute break in a moment. And I want to remind you all that this is going to be recorded. It's going to go up on Blackboard. So like, if you, take a breath, please, everybody, like stretch in a moment and like, yes, focus, sit here, listen to the lecture, and you'll also be able to review any stuff that you feel kind of like still confused by, as soon as I upload this to Blackboard. Okay. And Caden asked if the PowerPoints are going to be available, and yes, they are most certainly going to be available. Okay. So yeah, so I'm going to bring everybody back in about, let's say 7 minutes. So 11:02, please get up, please stretch. Don't stare at your screen for a little bit, even if you just sit there and close your eyes. Yeah, because I know that that's a lot of lecture today. So be sure to take care of yourself. All right, so 11:02, we're coming back. All right, if everybody wants to come on back, hopefully you had a good little stretch, little break for a minute. And now that we have talked about these, these ideas, hopefully, while all of it, I know a lot of it is a lot to take in, but there have been some things that you've been able to solidify in your mind for when you do that fun thing of going back around and making sure that you understand these ideas, that you'll feel like you can you've laid some groundwork, and you have some good footing to start and try to work through some of the implications, like thinking about how this is like looking at these obligations from different perspectives, how it functions as a web that we draw like these different moral obligations from, and perhaps even some ways in which there's certain familiar obligations, like not being rude, like demanding something versus like asking somebody to say pick up some orange juice from the grocery store for you, like how that might fit in this web that we've looked at from these different perspectives. So one of the big things that comes out of the ethics of persons are rights. And rights, like we're going to talk about, can mean a bunch of different things. We can talk about civil rights, we can talk about basic human rights, but all of that really can get some support, right? Like you can use, if you say like, all right, one of my premises in my argument why I say X behavior isn't okay, is going to be that the normative ethical theory, the ethics of persons is the right way to look at things. So assuming this is the right way to look at things, here's some stuff that falls out of it. So here's my framework. Here's one of my premises in my argument why it's rude to just demand things from a person. Part of one of my reasons for saying that can be this ethical theory. It can fit into an argument. And the way that works when we're talking about rights, very generally, but rights, is that if we think of ourselves as subjects, this is from the textbook, if we think of ourselves as subjects, as opposed to mere objects, and we are centering that specialness of humanness, there is some ways that we have to act. So this is in line with Kant, that protect that specialness about us. And those ways, like I was kind of saying before, like civil liberties and, fairness and equality, all that sort of stuff, can be understood as ones that pertain to our life and our freedom, our liberty. And without those sorts of things, an important thing here is that it's going to be really hard to exercise that special capacity that Kant talks about well, right? So our freedom in thought and thinking about things, expressing ideas, that's very much at the root of how people in the past have advocated for a democracy. So if you remember before, I was saying like, in the United States, like for our Constitution, right? Like in that world, assuming that's the right way to go, dictatorships really aren't okay. Somebody walking in and saying, well, I'm going to be the authority here. I'm going to get to decide everything for everyone else. And you all have to conform to my, what I want, what works best for me sort of thing. That's really not okay. So much of the sentiment, the sort of the ethical stuff floating around in the background that we see in things like this quote from Thomas Jefferson, adopt very much the same attitude that Kant was advocating for, in terms of really honoring and respecting that capacity to reason. And one of the things that falls out there is, giving people the means for really flourishing in that respect, right? Like not putting people in situations where maybe say they're forced to lie, something like this. Because in doing that, then like it really undercuts the whole process and saying like, all right, is this universalizable? Is it okay to treat people as a means to an ends? What does good society look like if everybody's kind of behaving in this way, sort of thing. So the kinds of expectations that we have, like what we might consider, that might involve like the rights that protect, or rather, rights can be understood in terms of, say, legitimate expectations. Like a legitimate expectation is that, somebody's not going to come up and randomly punch you in the face, right? Or a need, perhaps, can be understood as a right. So, say, like a right to access to healthcare. And these ideas, again, just to reiterate, this is another, I've been saying the same thing kind of like several times over in a different way, but those kinds of legitimate expectations and needs can be understood as rooted in our personhood, something that arises from this capacity we have to reason. So this is at the center of like what Thomas Jefferson is saying in this quote. He's talking about, that all men are created equal, sort of speaking to this revelation that God provides about, that aspect of their personhood, and that aspect of their personhood being inextricably tied to certain rights they have to perhaps like flourish, if they so choose, but also that, there shouldn't be anything going on that really undermines or prohibits that process, that flourishing process. And this entails a right to life, liberty, and not happiness necessarily, but the pursuit of it, like an ability to pursue it. And what Jefferson says is that, this is something that the government, as a, like kind of like for thinking about like what needs to go on in this kingdom of ends, this world where we're like aspiring to that kind of kingdom of ends, where everybody's like being treated in this good way, where they have all the means necessary for living a good, or like for pursuing a good life, and existing in a space where their personhood is being respected. We're going to find in that kind of, in that imaginary context, this ideal context, that a government, there's going to be some kind of organizing body that helps promote this, but does so at the consent of the people being governed, right? Like the people have decisive power over the ways in which those kinds of legitimate expectations are met, or those needs are provided for by the government. Okay. So does anybody have any questions about that? The connections? Yeah, Denise. Oh, actually, sorry, Denise, before you say anything, I want to say there are some very serious issues that we are going to dive into with both the ethics of persons, as well as this connection to rights, and in particular stuff going on, injustices in the United States.
Okay.
So was that your objection?
Yes.
Okay.
I was going to ask you if it was an example, but okay.
So there are the problems here we're going to see, interestingly, I think, are going to be connected with some of the central problems with the ethics of persons, because there's ways in which this looks like the ideal and it's really good, but then there's other ways in which we see a lot of exclusion happening. Before we get to that though, so I'm gonna write your name down. So as soon as I finish this slide here, Denise, I'm gonna ask you to give your comments. So just hold on to it. So before moving on, I just want to spell out a little bit more about what is involved, like the range of things that are subsumed under this category rights, because I've alluded to a bunch of different things, right? Like pursuit of happiness and liberty and, like the government doing certain things and healthcare, or, not getting punched in the face. Like that's a bunch of different stuff. So just for the sake of time, I won't get into any examples of basic rights. I think that everybody here probably can imagine some right off the bat. I think one that we can easily think of, or one of the ones that at least first comes to mind for me, is like freedom of expression, right? And that's something that the United States has codified in terms of the right to free speech. Another variation on rights, so another way to sort of like cut up the picture and try to define what this term rights means are rights that can be understood either as positive rights or negative rights. So I spoke about this in the very beginning of class when I mentioned this thing about, there might be some positive rights like healthcare, right? Like needs that we might think society is obligated to provide or to meet, and like help us sort of position ourselves where we're capable of pursuing happiness, right? Like if we lived in a place where people could just sort of establish like their own little dictatorships, and then just say like, all right, like, X group of people gets X goods and services and this sort of thing. And then like Y group of people, they don't get anything, right? What we might end up finding there is like some feelings surrounding like, hey, wait, why does this group get, housing and healthcare and food and those sorts of things, but this other group doesn't. So that thinking there, that sense of like, well, maybe there should be certain things that are provided. I mean, and not something even as contentious just in our current social climate, something not even as contentious as like healthcare, but just like, is there an obligation to provide roads, access, public education, these sorts of things? Those are very much positive rights, right? Like making the roads, having the schools available, those are positive rights as well. Now, negative rights, I think we're deeply familiar with, because for the most part, like I said, the Bill of Rights is almost exclusively concerned with our negative rights, like the First Amendment. You have a right for the government not to stop you from doing something, not to stop you from taking a certain kind of action. We have, a right not to be coerced into contracts with people, or a right to have others, like not form deceptive agreements with us in terms of like maybe like an employment contract sort of thing. In those cases, what we have are various ways in which somebody like their ability to do something, to take a certain kind of action, is cut off. I think that really the First Amendment is such a good thing to keep in mind there, because it's like we have this idea of like being gagged somehow, right? Like the threat of violence, like inhibiting somebody from like expressing a thought, saying something like this, like just like the government saying like, oh no, you're gonna like, I think that we, there's a lot of ways in which other foreign governments get vilified in the United States, sometimes for good reason, sometimes not so much, but just sort of depicted as this like, look, they're like gagging people, they're not letting them say these things, like their rights to like expression are being violated, right? So those kinds of rights, stopping people from doing, those are what we would consider to be negative rights. Okay. And yeah, so I mean, I am kind of zooming through this this portion on rights, in large part because I think that for the most part, people here are pretty familiar with a lot of have like in mind a lot of the kinds of rights that are at sort of the top of our concerns in the United States. And in particular, like this, one of these very problematic claims associated with the quote from Jefferson, but yeah, men having a right to equality, right? A right to freedom, these sorts of things. And those in particular are the kinds of rights that we really need to see or look more closely at some of the connections between the problematic ways in which those rights are protected in this country and problems in the ethical theory, the ethics of persons. So we're going to examine those in just a moment. I'm going to ask Denise to make her comment, but before we get there, I just want to reiterate another thing I spoke about in the beginning of class, where there's a lot of good stuff that the ethics of persons gives us, right? Like there's a lot there that like aligns with I can tell just based off of like responses in the chat box, like things that are familiar, like times where, like, yeah, you've said like the way that person talked to me was rude. And oh, wow, like I could cash this out, or I could give an argument explaining why that was rude behavior by appeal to the ethics of persons. One of the major problems with Kant, and I think that there's like there may be like a connection in with like how these rights are implemented as well, is that is something that, or the way that those rights are conceived of rather in this country as well, is like there's a difference between saying, yeah, this matters, and saying, oh, respecting personhood is the only thing that matters. So we're going to talk about some really serious issues with this ethical theory, but I don't want that to lead anybody to just right off the bat say, okay, we got to throw this theory out. There's some good parts of it there. Maybe not by virtue of what Kant gave us necessarily, but there might be parts of that we could sort of use to generate our own sort of patchwork in combination with, or in consideration of some of the other things, values that we're going to talk about with other ethical theories. We can bring that together and subsume it perhaps under another theory, or have it work in tandem with like another ethical theory, some other ethical values that don't fall out directly from just this idea that the specialness of humans is something that is something from which all of our moral obligations follow. All right. Limitations. There's a lot to say here, and I'd first like to start out with Denise. What was the issue you were going to raise when I had that Jefferson quote up?
It was basically when I saw like the pursuit of happiness.
Oh, okay.
Automatically I thought about what you were saying, and I just had a question, like if it was in reference or pertaining to like with what's going on with the people that are being transported by bus to all the different states. So would that fall under what this is all about?
Let me see if I understand your question right. Are you saying that there was like that this use of the term like pursuit of happiness is something that like kind of not, it's something that doesn't totally align with what Kant was saying? Or are you saying that the way that those ideals expressed, like say Jefferson's ideals, we'll just say that, or like in the United States, those ideals, the way that they're implemented or the way that people act on them are inconsistent with what Kant was saying? Like, which are
Ye-
the two?
Inconsistent, because like when they got here, they had the expectations. And like when they petitioned for the hotel that they were supposed to stay in and they didn't end up staying there, does this fall into that? Like,
So I feel like maybe what you're tapping into is a problem concerning exclusion, where they're saying all in this statement. Like, I mean, they're saying, she's saying all men.
mhm,
Even you're saying like even all men.
right, would
You really
that
feel
be
you
a good
probably
example?
wouldn't be doing it. So, philosophy being philosophy, I think that, one could argue either. However, what I want us to focus on in just this last little bit of class and talking about the limitations of the ethics of persons, I think I want us to focus on how, unfortunately, this exclusionary nature of the ethics of persons is one that I think actually gives rise. It actually supports the kind of clearly abhorrent behavior that you described when I can't remember which senator it was, but somebody like lied to a group of people who had just immigrated to the United States and convinced them to get on a bus and then sent them to another part of the United States. And I mean, that's clear cut using somebody as a means to an end, right? Because, or just solely as a means to an end, because not only was deception involved, but that was a huge political stunt, right? Like, it was somebody saying like, oh, let's see how much like you like it when we send these people your way. And that term, these people there, is just fundamentally in and of itself dehumanizing. There was no humanity being recognized there. It was like, oh, you fall into this category that I'm really hateful towards. And I'm just going to make a show of like how much of a joke I think that is, right? Like, it's like really gross. It was Greg Abbott. Thank you. Yeah. So I think that there is actually a connection there. And before we get to this problem, because there is something that is very exclusionary about this part of Kant. Let me just pull it up. It's from the background. Yeah, here we go. There is something, our starting point. So you remember, I went from like, okay, ethics of persons, and then we're going to talk about Kant's argument. And I was like, the background for Kant's argument, his starting point is this capacity to reason, this specialness of humans. That's how he's cashed it out. And that is something that very much aligns with the kind of ideology or moral principles that underpin what Jefferson is saying here. And there is something that is fundamentally exclusionary about that. Before we get to that point, I just want to quickly bring up sort of like the number one out the gate objection that we see concerning Kant's view. And that involves that step he took of being like, no hypotheticals. We need a categorical imperative, right? And one of the problems with that is that there are certain moral values that we derive on a subjective basis. So what does that mean? Like values that we associate with special relationships that we have. I think something just based off of previous conversations that we've had in this class, I've heard a lot of people talking about value of family and value of friends, extended family, maybe chosen family, this sort of thing, right? Like for Kant, you never make any special expectations, right? Everything applies categorically and across the board, no special circumstances. So one of the examples that the lying example that I gave, he had like this justification for it. And he also in the text, he talks about killer coming and a murderer coming and knocking at your door, and the murderer is like, hey, have you seen, I can't remember, like this, I think it was like your neighbor. All right, sorry, let me start again. Your neighbor runs over to your house, bangs on the door, and is like, hey, there's a murderer out to kill me. Can I please hide in your house? And you're like, yeah, of course. They hide in your house. Murderer comes a couple minutes later, knocking on the door. Hey, have you seen your neighbor? I'm going to kill that person. And Kant says, it's not okay to lie. It's never okay to lie. You are exploiting all of the truth tellers out there and all those people that came to all of they went through the process. They used that capacity to reason. They instituted this practice. And this practice exists by virtue of everybody following that rule. And here you are making an exception for yourself. It's not okay. It doesn't matter. Doesn't matter what the stakes are, right? All that matters is that you don't exploit all the non-liars out there in order for you to get away with your lie here. And Kant was writing this, I guess, semi-interestingly, before the Holocaust happened in Germany, right? Like that was an instance where we saw on a very widespread scale, a lot of murderers coming to people's doors and asking them where their neighbors are because they wanted to kill them because they were Jewish. And a lot of people lied. And those cases, I think, it's really hard to say, like, what do we do? Like, clearly, under those circumstances, the right thing to do was lie there. And Kant can't help us explain why. It's a big gap in his theory. There are interesting ways that a lot of scholars have gotten around this and discussed it. Like personally, like I've read and worked with people that have made really compelling arguments about how Kant can actually explain why it might be, why that kind of behavior may be morally permissible. That's like a technical issue with his theory. But connected with that, definitely, I think like something that is whether or not, we can sort of construe Kant in a way, sort of like go in and get all detailed and give these complicated arguments about actually his theory is really consistent with it being okay to like save your Jewish neighbor. There still remains a really big problem about how, we do want some hypothetical imperatives involved. We want some relationship-based moral values, or rather we want to like protect those kinds of moral values because they're really important. And his theory does have a really hard time explaining why, say you have any special obligations to like a parent or a family member who's really important to you, that you don't have to just like a random person on the street. So that's the first issue. The second issue involves a problem of exclusions, or a problem of exclusion. And this is the one that I think is the most pervasive when it comes to thinking about like the fact that I'm sure a lot of you have thought about this already. When Jefferson said men here, he literally meant men. And does anybody else want to take a stab at who it was not just men, it was a certain kind of men. Can somebody tell me what kind of men Jefferson was picking up?
I was going to say
What was that? Right?
white men.
White men. Yeah, I think there was somebody else in there. Yeah, white men, not only white men, white property owners. Those were the people who could vote. Those are the people who were considered citizen. We have gender, class, and race built in to this concept of who counts as the kind of person who needs to be respected. And like Jefferson was very, very clear that he did not consider people, Black people in particular, to be full persons. And this was something that was built into the Constitution when it was originally written. And there's a lot of very compelling arguments that people have made talking about how pervasive that ideology was. And just because there was a war fought over, making like a war fought for the abolition of slavery, and just because the side that advocated for the abolition of slavery won, doesn't mean that those problems didn't continue to persist. If anything, we have a lot of very strong evidence, mainly evidence that we have because the Reconstruction era, so the era post the Civil War, was in every way a major failure. We have a lot of just like basic, like the laws, like just evidence based on like, okay, then this law was put in place, then that law was put into place. But you have like a very clear, like that exclusionary nature of our government's framework is something that has persisted. And a lot of it comes down to how we define what our criteria is for who counts as a person. Because once we look a little bit more closely, what we find is that it ends up being pretty exclusionary. And there's a lot of people that many of us would think of as humans that don't belong to this much narrower category, at least as it's put in the or thought of in the Constitution, this much narrower category of who counts as a person. And one of the connections that we can draw between this and the ethics of persons is a serious problem with rooting the idea of personhood in our capacity to reason. Has anybody thought about, or the textbook talks about this a little bit at the end of the chapter. Can anybody say like one group, if like we say that people are human by virtue of their capacity to reason, is there any group that comes to mind that wouldn't, like a group of people that wouldn't actually get counted as people? Can anybody think of one? Lisa, yeah.
I think it would be fetuses. Sometimes when like you think of like
not just a fetus though. Like, I mean, I think that there's plenty there's plenty of people that don't consider a fetus to be a full person. So let's say try to think of a group that we feel is like very much a full person, that if it's just the capacity to reason, they would be considered a person. You're on the right track though. So maybe just go little tiny bit older.
Okay.
So sorry. So like kids, do kids have this full capacity to reason that I was talking about? Formulating these arguments, this ability to universalize and all that stuff? No, right? Shaneely brings up people in a state of unconsciousness, people with cognitive disabilities, right? There are plenty of people with cognitive disabilities where like they can't. And I mean, I think that when we really start to dig into looking at various attitudes, biases, prejudices towards other groups, what we often find in the dehumanizing process is negative associations made with like poor people, like, oh, poor people don't have like the time to like actually be good people, right? Like you remember the vegan example that we've talked about, I've mentioned in the past, where I've said like, and that's not all vegans, but definitely some vegans like saying like, well, like you have to have X amount of money and X amount of free time in order to be a good person, right? Like be able to respect and honor and all that stuff. Like you're saying like, oh, well, that group, because of their circumstances, they don't have the means necessary to like really act with like full moral agency there. Their choices are kind of constrained. And having that kind of constrained choice by circumstance, something like just like having to like work all the time or living in poverty even, for Kant, like that could undermine somebody's capacity to reason. They're not going to have the time to think about things and universalize and all of that stuff. And as a result, if they get really like deep in those ways, it's not totally clear. Like if somebody doesn't have the time or the money to sit around and pontificate about things the way that Kant did, it's not really clear on his theory whether they actually count. If it's impossible for them to exercise that capacity, even if they maybe have it, it's not really clear if they get a count as the kind of people that we should be honoring and respecting in these moments. Yeah. So Jose is talking about people with drug addiction. I think that's an even better example, right? Like where it's like there's something happening on a chemical level that's like inhibiting this like capacity to reason process that makes it so they can't. And if we base all of our moral obligations on the idea that we're respecting those who can exercise this capacity to reason, we are leaving out a lot of people. And that perhaps is one of the most disturbing consequences of maintaining this view and saying that the personhood is the only thing that matters, right? And it shouldn't be any coincidence, I think, that the issues that we see when we read like that quote from Jefferson, and we're like, okay, yeah, man, specifically white man who owns property, right? When we see how exclusive that is, it's not any coincidence that that kind of exclusivity followed from a theory that was rooted in this like, well, we're going to give some criteria of who counts as a rational person, and then people are going to have certain moral obligations by virtue of that connection to those people. Because if we can't draw that connection, right, to say somebody who is like struggling with drug addiction, has cognitive like disabilities that like undermine that reasoning process, if there's no connection there, guess what? There's no moral obligations either, right? So yeah. And again, I want to reiterate, that doesn't mean that we throw the whole thing out. That just means that we have a serious problem if this little ball that Kant was looking at is like the only thing in our like normative ethical theory universe, essentially. And yeah, so, and there like anybody who is interested, there's work that Kant did not in philosophy. He actually didn't start doing philosophy until he was 40. He was like doing biology and geology actually a lot prior to that, that are like deeply disturbing and troubling. And it's, and I think that we end up seeing a lot of how exclusionary he was in that work show up as problems in his ethical theories as well. And that very much all ties into the Ta-Nehisi Coates article that was assigned at the end of chapter 5. So on that note, what I wanted to say is that I'm telling everyone now that the long answer question for the module 3 worksheet is going to be about that Ta-Nehisi Coates essay, the letter to my son, and is going to sort of give you an opportunity to draw some more connections with this problem of exclusion involved with these theories of rights and ethics of persons that end up really coming to fruition later on, so much so that like we can see them currently today. So yeah, just in case you didn't read the article, be sure to do it. It might even help to read it again. I mean, he's an amazing author, and reading it again and thinking about some of the stuff that we're talking about here will be a helpful way to get a leg up in nailing that long answer question on the module 3 worksheet. Okay. So yeah, so we're at time now for today.